Good day, everyone. My name is Brooks Jeffrey. I'm a professor of architecture at the College of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape Architecture at the University of Arizona. The slide presentation that you're about to see is based on an article that I wrote called From Azulejos to Zaguanes, the Islamic Legacy in the Built Environment of Hispano-America. And it was published in the Journal of the Southwest in the summer of 2003. And I'll give you a citation for this at the end of the lecture. But first, before I get started, I'd like to give a little background because I think the context is important for my particular point of view in presenting this information. I'm an architect by training and spent some time as a Peace Corps volunteer in the country of Yemen. In that capacity, I worked for a variety of different areas, including the rural areas, designing water systems for rural communities, as well as in the capital city of Sana'a, where I learned a lot about the Islamic architecture that was there and the magnificent buildings, particularly the vernacular earthen buildings that has now been designated as a World Heritage Site. I also spent a lot of time in Mexico prior to that, and I've been blessed to have spent time in looking at some of the vernacular and traditional architecture that's there. Have learned both the languages of Spanish as well as Arabic. And when I was in Yemen, after spending time in Mexico, it became very clear to me that there were some connections, both linguistically as well as architecturally, between the kinds of characteristics of the architecture in both countries. And it really struck me as something that I wanted to investigate more. When I returned from my Peace Corps volunteership, I was a faculty member at the University of Arizona here in Tucson and began to put together some information, was able to get some travel money with a grant that allowed me to then do some additional research, which resulted in this article and then this presentation. So I wanted to present this as sort of my lens, as it were, to how I got to make the observations that I have. And these have been recorded in other places and published in other places, but perhaps not as cogently as this presentation might be. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and get started on the presentation. First of all, I want to present an outline of the presentation. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about some historical events that are context to what you're about to see. So I'm going to be presenting a chronology of certain events that happened that provide a framework for the architectural expressions that are there. And also spend a little bit of time talking about the architectural characteristics of Islamic Spain. It's really important that we understand this is a vocabulary of characteristics that really express the culture and all the other forces that were part of that culture at that time. The second part of the presentation is going to be focused on the built legacy of Islamic Spain in Hispano-America. And I'll spend a little bit of time defining those terms as well. But I want to focus on three distinct areas: ornamentation, architectural form, and then open space. And I'd like to conclude then with talking a little bit about other forms of the Islamic legacy that I think we all take for granted, and yet we never really sort of put it in the context of the origins from the from the Islamic legacy that was there. So first, a little history. I'm assuming that you know some of Islamic history, and I'm not going to go into heavy detail except to provide a context for this presentation. It's important to understand that 7/11 is the beginning of the Islamic period in world history, and in Spain, rather. It started actually a century earlier in Mecca, in what is now Saudi Arabia. And so in the Arabian Peninsula, which is the origins of Islam, and just so that you are aware, Yemen, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is located in the southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula. There, we're about from where it says desert on below. So with Islam starting in Mecca and in the Arabian Peninsula, then spreading in various phases very quickly, it's one of the fastest growing religions of its time. It spread very, very quickly throughout the southern Mediterranean into what was then Persia, and then throughout North Africa and up to Spain. And the real sort of deterrent of it going any further were the mountains, the Pyrenees Mountains. So it's really important that in the context that we're talking about with Spain, we're really talking about a Spanish version of Islam, as it would be different in North Africa, it would be different in the Arabian Peninsula, and certainly different in the Levant and in Persia. So 711 is the beginning of when Islam really took hold in Spain. And it produced some of the Islam's greatest monuments. The one that you're looking at here, the Great Mosque of Cordova, is really a classic case of how Islam incorporated the particular kinds of styles that were there before. Spain, of course, before Islam was, it had a lot of different, it had Visigoth, it had Roman ruins, it had lots of different heritage prior to that. It's a very layered country. And so the Mosque of Cordova, interestingly enough, is really a composite building. It is constructed on Roman columns. So the picture that you see on the lower right shows Roman columns that were reused, supporting Islamic or Arab arches. And then in the 13th century, after the conquest of Cordova, a Catholic cathedral was inserted right in the center of the building. And so it has this sort of combination of all the cultures that have influences that particular area. And this is classic kind of approach to cultures that want to subjugate previous cultures by building on top of them and using remnants of the previous culture to remind people of who's in charge, who's in control now. But I also want to take this slide to introduce some of these architectural characteristics. The first one is the kind of building that you see. It's called a hypostyle hall, which are characteristic of the mosques in Islam. And this is compared to what Christians would see as a nave church. So in a nave church, you have a single aisle that points toward an altar at the end of that. And the processional quality of the church becomes important as in the religion. It's the idea of processing toward the sacred. In Islam, it's not, there is a focal point. It's the mihrab that is at the end, and that's the picture you see in the upper right, which is the focus. But it really is created as a community hall. And hypostyle hall actually has its origins in Egypt, but it's a massive open space that is a column or a forest of columns. And that forest of columns is really meant to emulate nature. And if you see in the aerial photograph the interior space then extends out into the exterior space in the courtyard, which is known as the Patio de los Naranjos, the orange patio. Because it now has orange trees and it had a variety of different fruit trees. But they are aligned with the columns. And I have another plan view that I'll show you later on, but you can see it in the aerial photograph where the alignment becomes very important to continue that vista, that perspective that goes all the way through the area, including this kind of diagonal vista, which we see in the photograph on the lower right, as it goes through the hall and focuses on the mihrab then. The other thing that I want to point out to you, of course, is some of the surface ornamentation that was used as a decorative device to really diminish the structural elements of the architecture. This is a pretty fundamental understanding of Islamic architecture, that there is a diminution, the diminishing of the character of the space. And it's done through a variety of different ornamentation devices and decorative features. Some cases it's calligraphy and Arabic calligraphy that professes various sacred texts. It could be geometric ornamentation as opposed to figural. So you won't see very many clear animals or people. You will see abstract versions of both, but never seeing the sort of realistic versions. Unlike Christianity, where there are figures of Christ and figures of prophets, you just will not see that in Islamic architecture. There's also a preference for geometric proportions, and particularly in as square or two squares that are offset, as in an eight-sided. And so you'll see eight being an eight-sided figures being very common that are there. And then finally, just the use of ceramic tiles, which in Spanish are called azulejos. And you'll see that in a variety of different features as we're going through. Here's another monument. It's beginning to show some of those other features that are there. This is the Alhambra in Granada. Again, the preference for both open spaces, the use of water as a common tool, but also emulating nature with that. Again, the forest of columns, emulating trees. But the image that I really want to focus on is the larger one showing the ceiling of a particular chapel or congregational area. And you take a look up there and you barely see the difference between the wall and the ceiling itself. Again, it's sort of diminishing the structural elements that are there. And you also see this eight-sided star, which if you take a look at it abstractly are really two squares that are offset at 45 degrees to create this eight-sided star. And then, of course, the use of plaster and wood to diminish the surface right around what are known as squinches. It's the transition between the wall and the actual dome that's there. And this idea that in Islamic architecture, the ceilings are really meant to emulate a dome of heaven. And in fact, our word ceiling comes from Latin as well as the word in Spanish, cielo, which has a double meaning of both ceiling as well as heaven. And so this idea that these ceilings are really meant to emulate an image of heaven that are there. I also want to talk a little bit about the origins of some of the open space in the development of mosque as a typology. The mosque form was really developed, its origins go back to the Prophet's house, which you see a conjectured rendering of on the right, on the left. Which was really an open space, as was characteristic in the desert, and it was a vernacular tradition. It was a compound, basically, but was really used then as a prototype for the development of a mosque typology. A best example of which is you can see on the right, which is the mosque in Susa in Tunisia. So here the characteristics are beginning to be much more in a mature form. So it's the idea that you have basically a square building, but the focus is not the building, it's actually the open space. So the open space becomes the primary feature of Islamic architecture. And in that you see a centering device. In the case of Mecca, it is actually the Kaaba, the sacred stone that is the origin and centering of the spiritual home of Islam. But you'll also see in mosques the use of other devices and architectural features to act as a centering device within that particular courtyard. You also see then that the courtyard is basically square. It is surrounded by an arcade that allows for walking around it and shade, of course. And then the building itself is composed of different components, including little mini courtyards in the middle of it. So here you have this sort of grammar of vocabulary around which we're going to begin to see some derivations as we move forward in other examples of both mosques, and then how this form translates into other kinds of urban forms throughout Hispano-America. So again, this idea that open space is really the object of the architecture. It's not building as object, but rather building as enveloping space. And here you see a great example of it in a town like Toledo in Spain, where on first glance you take a look at it and it looks chaotic and very organic in terms of the way the streets are arranged, the way in which the sort of circulation and the actual urban form. But if you understand, you take a look at it and you realize that the geometric order that you see visually there is represented in the open spaces. So if you look hard, you'll see that there are squares, the larger squares and rectangles, but the larger openings are actually the mosques in that view of Granada. You'll see even smaller ones that represent domestic and other kinds of buildings, where again, open space was really the objective of a formal geometric ordering system. And this spatial ordering then also has another meaning, which is really about spiritual centering. And so the spiritual centering is done at a variety of different scales. It can start at the domestic unit, the house, where the courtyard and its open space to the sky acts as a personal centering for the spiritual well-being of the particular person residing there. Then you have it at the communal level, which means that the mosque becomes the open space that is that centering device. And then you have it for the entire sort of religious world. And in this case, it's centered on Mecca and the Kaaba that's there. And so you can take a look at this then as contrasting these preferences between the kind of starting off with Roman and then Islamic preference for formal geometries of open space. And you contrast that with the Northern or Western European preference for the formal geometries of buildings. And again, repeating what I said earlier, that the open space really is the focus of the built environment, as opposed to the building as object in space, which is much more of our Western kind of view of architecture in its place in an urban form. And the slide on the image on the right conveys this in an urban form in Cairo, where it doesn't matter what the chaotic exterior view is along a street, but what is really sacred is the geometries of the open courtyards, which is where you have that sort of formality of space. So going back to our chronology here, I want to sort of talk about, it didn't take long, it took about a century after Islam was established in Spain for the Christian reconquest, the Reconquista, that really begins in the northern part of Spain. And what you'll see by this map, you'll see that this Reconquista really took place over the course of almost 600 years, where they began the reconquest. And so from 711 to 1492, Spain was an Islamic country, but beginning in the 9th century, that was begin to diminish. And so the real focus of the Spanish influence is in southern Spain. And you see that this area is known as Andalusia or Andalus in the Arabic definition of it. But it really focused on 3 major cities that were there: Córdoba, Granada, and Sevilla. And the other important dates here to understand is in 1478, the Spanish Inquisition begins. And again, this is just another instrument in the subjugation process where Spain was trying to classify various kinds of religious classes of people. And again, it should be noted that prior to this, there was a great deal of tolerance in the Spanish Peninsula or the Iberian Peninsula, in terms of the kinds of peoples and religions that were practiced. And so it was well known, and it was documented in many literary sources, that there existed Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and there was a level of tolerance there, and produced a true flowering of culture, both literature and music and art, and of course architecture, that really represented this sort of flowering of tolerance that was there. It wasn't until the Christians began this reconquest and the kind of purification process that happened that we begin to see the divisions between religions and between classes of people. Now, in the early stages of this Spanish Inquisition, there was a period of tolerance between the Christians and the Muslims, but there was a classification of different religious definition. And the first of these are the class of people that were known as Moriscos. And now these are Muslims who willingly or by force converted to Christianity, but in practice really remained Muslim. The other class of people that were defined at that time were called Mudejares. These are unconverted Muslims who really lived as vassals to the Christian monarchs. So these were the people that were really subjects of the monarchs. And so they were classified in that way. And the Mudejares were really the ones who were dominant class of people in Spain at that time. The other key important date here is 1492. Americans know this is when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but it was also the time when the Reconquest really ended in Spain, and Spain really became a Christian country. And in this, then, the Inquisition, as an instrument of this reconquest, shifted toward a policy of purification of the Iberian Peninsula. And so the sort of tolerance was no longer there, but rather this sort of purification. And it was really meant to rid the Iberian Peninsula of all non-Christians. So this included not only Muslims and Jews, but also Gypsies, who were seen as non-Christian as well. Now, of course, coinciding with this was the discovery of the Americas and the exploration that was beginning to take place in all parts of the world. And Spain was a world power and were one of the first to begin the exploration process. And so in this, at the same time that they were expelling Jews and Muslims, they were also sailing over to the New World. And there was a set of legislation that was established to really screen those people that were sailed to the Americas. But the pressure to leave was so great by some of these non-Christians. It was very clear that many of these Jews and Muslims emigrated to the Americas, including the Mudéjars. Now, during this period, which is known as the Mudéjar period, we have a number of buildings that begin to show the kind of architectural elements that are a translation of the Islamic into what are fundamentally Christian buildings. So both buildings that you see on the slide here, the Alcázar in Sevilla, as well as the Casa de Pilatos, were Christian buildings built for Christian monarchs. In the case of the Alcázar, for King Pedro I, and the Casa de Pilatos was a private residence, but are basically palaces. But using the Mudéjar style, and it's not really a style as much as an expression, really began to Christianize the use of these Islamic characteristics, and became an acculturation, a blending of Islamic architectural characteristics, but basically on non-Islamic buildings. And it wasn't just palaces like this, but it was also on Christian churches, synagogues, and then again, large palaces, both here in Spain and, as we'll see later, in the Americas. And as I mentioned before, Mudéjar is less of a style, but rather sort of a unifying expression of styles that existed before, that were seen in religious traditions. And this is really the highest expression of this was done in the 13th and 14th century in Spain, but extended well beyond that. And it's significant that the abundance of these Mudéjar buildings are in Sevilla, again, primarily because of the deep roots of Islamic tradition that stayed in Sevilla, in Andalusia, in the south of Spain. But it was significant in terms of our discussion today because Sevilla was the administrative center and point of departure to the New World. And so here we have all of this sort of milieu of architectural expression that became a part of the memory of those who went to the Americas and took with them what they thought was Spanish architecture and architectural characteristics. And also the Mudéjares during this particular period of time were the craftsmen and the master builders of Spain's best monuments during this period. And so it was, whether it was Islamic or Christian, it really became part of that skilled workforce that emigrated to the Americas. And again, just to sort of point out some of the architectural features, some of which we've seen before, but here you see some of the decorative ways in which the buildings are expressed with decorative features, as well as the classic horseshoe arch, which is actually a Visigoth, and I say Visigoth, not Gothic, but Visigoth architectural feature, but also just sort of the use of decorative tiles and decorative features throughout. I want to show you some other buildings that were done during this Mudéjar period and showing these different characteristics. You see there are the ceilings, these wooden ceilings that are known as Artesonado. artisan is a kneading trough that was used for making bread. And so the Artesonado ceiling is a upside down trough that is put up and highly decorated, again, emulating a ceiling or a cielo or heaven that was used, so that different varieties and forms and materials were used to create these ceilings and emulating the heaven that was there. The other features that you see a lot is the kind of tapestry-like exterior decorative brickwork. And you see it in the middle image here of a tower in Spain. This one is in Teruel, but you also see it in Sevilla, for example, in La Giralda, which was a former minaret and now a Christian bell tower. And the image on the right is this classic use of geometric forms, as well as here we see some abstract images of nature, which you see in the middle band there of trees that are abstracted. And then above that, the Arabic script. Now, again, you have to understand these are Christian buildings. The Alcazar is a Christian building, and we're using Arabic script, even though the Roman language or the Roman alphabet was used at this particular time by the Christians that were there. So there's this blending that takes place, whether it's Arabic calligraphy that's used on Christian buildings, or the use of Islamic and mudéjar traditions to create these beautiful ceilings made out of wood or other plaster or other kinds of things. It really became part of that vocabulary in this period of time in Spain. The last slide I want to show you in terms of historical background is really just trying to have you understand that Spain was really a hinge for the discovery throughout the rest of the world. And what an important time the 15th and 16th centuries were in terms of discovering by many countries. Portugal, Spain, Holland, even England at the time were exploring and discovering the Americas and colonizing the Americas, as well as trying to find trade routes. It was an amazing time to be exploring, and there were lots of different experimentations that were going on. And the Spanish colonization of the New World really was part of that larger cultural shift that took place. And of course, they were trying to find what they thought were the Indies, which they discovered there was a whole continent in between Spain and the Indies. But you'll hear references to the Indies throughout this. In this presentation and in my paper, I refer to it as Hispano-America, because there were many Americas. There was a Dutch America, there's clearly an English America, French America, but Hispano-America really is focused on the influences from Spain itself and how those translated to the New World. And also understand that during the Islamic period, where during its apogee, the Islamic scholars rediscovered the classic Greek texts. They preserved and translated many of the classic scientific texts. They developed and expanded the sciences of astronomy. Islam really produced an amazing cultural influences that then became integrated into the sciences of the periods of time from then on, the Renaissance, and of course following through with their translation of that to the New World. I also want to focus on the date that's there, 1573, where Spain's King Philip at the time published what was known as the Laws of the Indies. The Laws of the Indies, which began in 1573 and were continuously updated all the way up to about 1680, covered many areas of how you should settle and how you should treat the natives, how you should create new towns, but also created very strict policies about who should go to the Americas. And so by 1573, now again, we're about 75, 80 years after the first departure in 1492 to the Americas, and the numbers of people that were moving to the New World at that time, many of whom were these mudéjares. And it was codified in this 1573 document that there should be the expulsion, not the prevention of Muslims, but the expulsion from the Indies of what was known as all Berbers, meaning those people of Arab descent, as well as Moors that were recently converted to Christianity. And so this idea that there's a recognition that already there were a considerable number of mulejares that were finding their way to the Americas, to the point at which they actually had to codify a law that, again, not only prevented them from continuing to go over there, but that actually expelled them from their position. So here we're making a case for the fact that there were many people that were basically closeted Muslims that were in the Americas. This is also true for the Jews, too. There was a number of Jews, and those of you familiar with the American Southwest know of the conversos, the Jews who converted to Christianity to come over here and were part of colonies in New Mexico, in northern New Mexico, that began their own communities in this part of the world. So there were many impure, in the Spanish terms, people that were coming that were non-Christian. And some of these became famous, including Esteban the Moor, who accompanied Cabeza de Vaca and other explorers like Marcos de Niza and Coronado throughout this area of the world known as New Spain. And of course, they were in search of riches in the seven cities of Cibola. But regardless of these decrees and laws, Hispano-America really became a place for a new beginning for many immigrants, both Christians and Muslims and Jews, and really was a place free from persecution that was unavailable in Spain, and now was possible because of the sort of new opportunities that were there. It's also interesting in this, the Laws of the Indies, book 4, for those of you who are interested, is really talking about the creation of prescriptive guidelines for the establishment of towns. And we're going to talk about that later, but it was heavily influenced by, at the time, Vitruvius's 10 books of architecture that really laid out what were appropriate models for town building. So we're going to shift focus here to the second part of the presentation and talk about the built legacy of Islamic Spain in Hispano-America. As I mentioned before, these really are expressed in 3 different scales. Ornamentation really is the strongest of them. But each of these, and then architectural form, and then open space. And as I've mentioned before, each of these scales contains a vocabulary of elements that carried the Mudéjar expression to Hispano-America. But the other thing to remember is that this wasn't a prescriptive, written in a book approach to the translation of whether it's stylistic or architectural forms. But a lot of it had to do with the visual memory of what was already in Spain. And it no longer really became associated with any religious meaning, as much as it was more seen as both in terms of the way in which buildings should be built, the use of ornamentation, both in a sense of delight that is there as part of the built environment. And as Mudéjar influences became more incorporated into the standard vocabulary of Hispano-American art and architecture, the original Islamic meaning underlying that expression was really lost. It no longer became an Islamic association, but it's not in an Islamic context, but rather in a Christian context, or might call a neo-Hispanic context that really represents the colonial experience and the process of cultural hybridization that took place, that was common throughout any of the colonial experiences. And this was particularly powerful in the earliest generations of the Spanish colonial community building in Hispano-America. And this was really primarily in the 16th century and in central Mexico, when they were really founding the early communities. And then as the provincial areas began to be developed all the way up to places like the Southwest United States, where I am now, you see it later on. But it was part of that freedom that people had to really express themselves in a way that they couldn't otherwise. So the first of these sets of Mudéjar expressions is that of ornamentation. Again, we've seen these Artesonado ceilings before, but here we have a case in Mexico. And I'm going to show you just some examples. There's many examples, but I want to show you some of the best ones to show you just how amazing this translation is. And I could put slides side by side between Spanish and Islamic buildings and Mexican buildings, and you can see the examples. But again, the foundation of information that I've provided you, hopefully you begin to see some of those direct translations where you see both the form of the ceiling as kind of emulating the heavens with intricate kinds of ornamentation that's there, the use of geometric proportions and geometric shapes such as eight-sided stars that really become a part of that vocabulary that again became less associated with Islam and became more associated with the way in which new churches and new buildings should be established. The next one is ornamental brickwork. I'll give you an example, two examples here. One is an amazing sort of fountain that was built in the 16th century in Chiapas, Mexico, where the use of a variety of different brick forms. And again, if you can compare this to some of the other sort of tapestry-like, or the use of brick as a tapestry, an ornamental tapestry for exteriors. I also want to point out to you on the slide on the right, this is San Javier, Mission San Javier, here in Tucson, Arizona. And you take a look at some of these beautiful interior. This happens to be a transept in the church itself. And one of the things that becomes really interesting is that these are highly decorated, but what you're seeing there, all of the various different forms are actually made of molded bricks. So the idea of brick making was highly associated with the mudéjares. Now, the styles at the time, like whether Gothic and some of the others, really relied on stonemasonry to be able to achieve their particular architectural expression. The mudéjares were more skilled in bricks. And because the mudéjares were seen as the master builders, they were the ones that were used to make some of these mission churches and other monuments that were during the Christian times in the New World. So everything that you see there, whether it's the sort of crown molding that you see on the right of the Islamic or the Mission San Javier, or the little skinny columns, many of these were done using molded bricks. Again, a skill and a trade that was brought over as part of that mudéjar experience. And of course, the most prolific legacy that was in the New World from the Islamic tradition are colored ceramic tiles. Again, they're known as azulejos in Spanish. And you see them all over Mexico. I've just given you a couple of examples of both a church from the 18th century outside of Mexico City, and then just a montage of how ceramic tiles are used prolifically as a surface decoration on buildings. And again, we think of this as a Mexican tradition, but of course, if you really do your history, you'll understand that these have roots back into Islamic legacy in Spain. I also want to show you a couple of, again, I'm using examples from Tucson because it's what I know, but also if you keep your eye open, you see the tentacles of these Islamic expressions reaching out to a variety of different places. So the slide on the right is our courthouse here in Tucson, which was built in the 20th century, but again, was done in this sort of Spanish colonial revival style that was very popular in the 1920s and 30s in the American Southwest and throughout the United States. But again, those iconic characteristics become that of ceramic tiles and colored ceramic tiles and the use of geometric shapes. And so you see this expression carrying on even into the 20th century. The slide, or the image on the left, again, going back to the Mission San Javier, which I found really interesting, notice the wainscoting here, that bottom layer, and what you see are these sort of colored, kind of M.C. Escher-like diagrams. And these are really a mission church's attempt to use ceramic tile in abstract, but using paint instead of the actual tile. So the purpose was the same, was to sort of diminish the monolithic character of the walls and create this kind of ornamented wainscoting that became a distraction for the eye and focus for contemplation. But because they didn't have access to ceramic tile, what they did was they just used it as an abstract pattern and created it with paint. A really interesting adaptation of that. And again, here we are really on the frontiers of the Spanish Empire during the colonial period here in the American Southwest. I also want to talk a little bit about floor plans and the idea that we often, the form can really, this as an architectural form, these plans can be divided into really two categories. One is, again, reinforcing this mudéjar preference for rectilinear shapes and squares and rectangles that could be proportioned out as squares. So again, proportion and geometry were very, very important to them. And so there was a sacredness to these geometric proportions. And then also the use of the hypostyle hall form that I mentioned to you before as a building type that was really well suited for the conversion process for large native populations. So in this slide, I want to talk a little bit about the architectural form of these single nave plans. So again, for Christian churches, we have a single nave. It's not a hypostyle hall, but a single nave. But again, the proportions are done in a way that these are replicating, for example, 3 squares put down, and these proportions became very important. But then you also see variations of angled apses that you see in the 2 left examples on the right image, on the left image. And then these plans were typical mudéjar churches in Spain. Now on the right image, what you see are the typical New Mexican single nave mission churches, which are all over New Mexico. And again, because New Mexico was really populated very heavily in the 16th and 17th century, and in 18th century too, there was a typology of mission churches that were used. And you see the use of this single nave with this sort of beveled apse right at the end there. That became sort of the iconic image of New Mexican churches, but really had its roots in Spain and the original mudéjar churches. I want to show you a couple of images of interiors of these single nave plans. Again, the image on the left showing a church in Mexico where you had that sort of single nave. There's no side aisles or anything, focused on the altar. And then one in New Mexico in Chimayo. But what's really interesting in these slides is not only the sort of as examples of these single nave plans, but as look at the ceilings of these. And what you're beginning to see is the sort of evolution or the evolving creation of derivatives of the wooden Artesonado ceiling. So what started off as a very deep trough of a wood ceiling has now become less deep and using wood in a more simplistic way, but clearly you begin to see the sort of connection of the simplistic derivation of the original mudéjar Artesonado ceilings, which are now becoming what in New Mexico are called vigas and zapatas. Vigas are the beams that extend across the entire width of the ceiling and the nave, and then these zapatas, which are the little shoes, literally, these little supports that are at the end. And so you see this evolution of going from a very deep ceilings that you see in the mudéjar Spain to a little less deep, a little less articulated in Mexico, and then translating and evolving even further into what has become kind of iconic New Mexican architecture of the Viga and Zapata traditions that are there. And were really part of the vocabulary of, again, what became known as the Pueblo revival, like the Spanish colonial revival of the 20th century. So what you see now are these Vigas and Zapatas all over the place in sort of almost stereotypical New Mexican architecture. And so again, more of these derivations of these ceilings. If you take a look at the image on the left, you see again the interpretation or the derivation of what were trough ceilings to one of basically Vigas and Zapatas. The left in Mexico, and both examples in Mexico, and then the highly decorated versions of these as they become more articulated as not as one large ceiling, but rather a series of decorated features. And I also want to talk about these hypostyle halls that are here, the use of large open spaces. This is a case where it was used in really two ways. One is a large congregational chapel as a direct application of the Islamic form, as you see in these slides here. And the other is the derivative form as an open-air chapel, or a capilla abierta, and I'll explain later. Here is an example, and I show you an image of the Great Mosque of Cordoba that we saw images, including in the aerial. And you can begin to see the kind of column layout of the church on the bottom, of the mosque on the bottom, and then the courtyard and the open patio on the upper part of that. And you see this translated into just a very, very few number of these hypostyle chapels in Christian Mexico. The best example that still exists is the Capilla Real in Cholula, Mexico. You see a plan of it there, this large hypostyle hall. The rendering on the bottom of there shows what it originally looked like. It didn't have domes, but rather wooden ceilings that were more like vaults, and probably more like the Mudéjar Artesonado kind of ceilings. And then in the 18th century, those ceilings were replaced and created domes, which of course makes it look even more like an Islamic mosque. And again, the derivation that took place, this evolution of what became hypostyle halls, then evolved into a variety of different kinds of devices that were used in churches to convert large, massive numbers of natives into Christianity. So we see a couple of examples here from Mexico of what became known as open-air chapels. So it's a derivation of the hypostyle hall, but then the use of open space and courtyards outside of those halls. And this was really an accommodation to many of the native traditions. So many of the Native Americans in the Americas used open spaces for ceremonial purposes. And so the priests and the powers that be were very smart of trying to sort of understand and utilize those traditions and begin to blend both Catholic traditions along with native traditions. And they express themselves in the architectural forms. And here's some other examples of these open-air chapels, Capillas Abiertas, throughout Mexico. And you can see there, in the case of the upper left picture, you have a standard facade of a church that you would go into, and then right next to it you have this sort of hall that was an open-air chapel with a plaza out in front for the conversion. So you really have this sort of bifurcated approach to how worship was done, particularly with native populations. And you can see a variety of different definitions of these. And then these evolved into yet another phenomenon that was really unique to Mexico, which are the atrios, these open spaces that were in front of churches that were there. Again, I think understanding the use of open space for ceremonial purposes in native cultures and adopting that into the traditional Catholic ceremonies. And some of these are vast. You see the image on the lower right. These are huge spaces that really almost emulated like a town square, a plaza. And speaking of urban plazas, I wanted to kind of go back to the laws of the Indies for a minute to talk about, remember if I told you about the book 4, where it talked about architectural characteristics of how to found a town. There was an ideal that was created in the laws of the Indies, again, based on Vitruvius, that was really focused on the golden mean, which is really more of a rectangle than it was a square. And these were codified in books, but this was the ideal, but not in practice. What really happened in practice was the plazas that were developed throughout the New World, and the research that I did really confirmed this, were really square. They weren't rectangular. So even though the laws of the Indies as a prescriptive device for new towns were established, really didn't follow them, but they followed the traditional forms that had been carried over from the urban spaces that they knew before. And where do those spaces come from? Well, they came from open mosques in Spain and other large areas that were really focused on open spaces that were square rather than rectangular. And again, you see this proliferation of open space as the dominant architectural form. So in the image on the right of the town plan from Caracas, you have Plaza, which is an open space, and the squares all around there say casa, 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 house, house, house. And of course, in each one of those would have been a courtyard, an open space, again, with this notion of open space not only as a vernacular response to climate, but also as a spiritual one and as a centering device, both for the individual as well as the community. And you see great examples of these here. These are just images from Oaxaca showing the use of the facade and the open spaces that were there. And so finally, I want to end with some of these other sort of expressions that I think we all take for granted. My favorite is the idea of Arabic numbers. The fact that if it weren't for the Arabs, we'd all still be counting with Roman numerals. And you know, those of you who try to do math with Roman numerals, it's really quite hard. But the Arabic numbers that we use today are really an abstraction of sort of sacred geometries. And so the idea that you have numbers that represented the number of acute angles. And so if those of you who have European friends who you write the number 1 with actually 2 lines, up and then down, never really understood why they did that. It's because in Arabic numbers, that actually had a purpose. It represented a 1 angle, and a 2, like a Z, had 2 angles, and 3, 4, etc. And then 0, which is a perfect circle, had none. And so this idea that there was this sacred geometries were very important, but they emulated and were distributed throughout everything that they did that was there. And it really became an important part of their lives. Ironically, of course, in the Arab world today, they don't use Arabic numbers. They use Hindi numbers at this point. But the rest of the world uses Arabic numbers, again, showing the strong, prolific influence that the Islamic sort of flowering of culture really had as an influence in the rest of the world. I also, because I'm a language geek and because I learned Spanish, and it became very clear that much of the language around construction and architecture and urban form really derived from Arabic. And again, some of these we use in everyday terms, particularly in architecture. So Adobe has an Arab origins. Even the word barrio comes from the Arabic. I mentioned before azulejos, the tiles, and you can see all the way down to acequias, the water courses that you find throughout New Mexico and Arizona, and even in Texas and California. So again, the Arabic language is really present in Spanish, less so in English, but you still see it in quite a few areas. So that concludes this presentation. And I want to leave a slide here that if you want to read the article that from which this was drawn, there it is up on the screen. I welcome you to contact me if you have any questions. That's my email here at the University of Arizona. I appreciate your attention to this, and feel free to contact me with any questions that you might have. Thanks.